I have to say it's been really great getting to know you all so well over these past several months, and I have to admit, though, that I'm looking forward to a break from all these Blue Room briefings. I'm sure you are, too, the number of times we're in here talking about this same subject. Unfortunately, we're here again today because we are now halfway through the month 4 of our fiscal year, still without a budget. And as I warned in our first meeting more than 3 months ago, the consequences of inaction are severe, and they grow more dire every day we try to fund our state government without a budget in place. When we talked just last month, I highlighted the cash shortage in our state that we are experiencing as we continue to run our government through court orders and mandates. Our office is currently abiding by more than 14 different court orders and consent decrees and additional state and federal mandates that require us to pay everything from Medicaid to our state's debt service. In fact, we're paying about 90% of the state's bills now that we covered under last year's budget, and we're required to pay them at last year's levels, even though our state revenue is expected to be $5 billion lower this year. And note that the funding levels that we're paying are set by the court, and they stay the same regardless of fluctuations month to month in the state's revenues. I've warned that the unbalanced spending that our state is currently going after is unsustainable, and that it will result in cash shortages and an even larger stack of unpaid bills and increasing delays for our many state vendors. It was just over a month ago, in fact. At that time, the state had an unpaid bill backlog of $6 billion. Today, that backlog has grown to $6.9 billion, and we remain on track to have $8.5 billion in unpaid bills at the end of our calendar year. We also discussed how the state's cash flow grows tighter each passing day, and today that too is becoming increasingly evident. In fact, as we hit our halfway point of October, it is clear that based on the expected revenues and the mandated expenditures, that our state will fall short of the cash that we needed necessary to make our monthly pension payment in November. The monthly pension payment of $560 million is the largest consistent expenditure that we have throughout the year. And it is one of the few areas where we have some flexibility because it is not covered by a court order and the delay will not cause immediate hardship. We will still send out retirement checks, but we will have to tap the corpus of the retirement funds to do so. We have consistently prioritized the pension payment to avoid adding any more to the over $100 billion unfunded pension liabilities that has been fueled by our state's short-sighted decisions of the past, including things like pension holidays and borrowing to make those payments. I will not repeat those mistakes. While we are unable to make our retirement systems payments in November and possibly in December, we will use every available dollar in the higher revenue months that we get this spring to catch up our obligations and ensure that our expected payments are fully made before the end of our fiscal year. But in doing so, we will also limit our liability to pay down on that backlog of bills that we usually are able to do when our tax revenues increase, since those dollars will instead be used to pay back our pension funds. To be clear, this decision is choosing the least of a number of bad options, and it saddens and really it frustrates me that we are even at this point. But the fact is that our state simply does not have enough revenue to meet the obligations that we are currently facing. Last week I was asked what I thought about speculation from some in our state that we would run out of money in February or March if we did not get a budget in place soon. And I have to say, frankly, I was astounded by that comment. But it certainly explains the mentality that has gotten us into this debt that we are in, spending more money than we have year after year. Technically, we never really get to a zero balance in our state's bank accounts because, of course, money comes in on a daily basis from tax revenues. But in reality, we run out of money every single day. Like a household that is drowning in debt, that we use whatever funds we can to fend off the creditors for one more day. And we piece together days of revenue in order to make those higher payments to meet our larger obligations. And no matter what we pay today, we still have billions of dollars in bills that we owe tomorrow. In fact, nearly $7 billion as we sit today. Yesterday, we had about $142 million in the bank, and we have $7 billion of bills to pay. Now, sometimes I think all those zeros make it hard for us to wrap our minds around the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with. So let me make it simple. Imagine if you had $142 million, or imagine if you had $142 in your bank account, and you're looking at your kitchen table and you have $7,000 worth of bills piled all over it. And you know that you have another $1,000 coming in, you just haven't received those bills yet. Would you think you still had money to spend? Would you think you had any money at all? Would you look at that cash on in hand and think that it was time for a trip to the mall? Or would you be worried about creditors calling, your electricity being turned off, or your house going into foreclosure? This is the predicament that our state faces every single day. For all intents and purposes, we are out of money now. Illinois literally does not have another dollar to spend. And yet we continue passing bills. For some of those bills, they have a noble intent of trying to help those less fortunate. But it doesn't help to promise funding if we do not have the money to write the checks. So what's the answer? As I've said time and time again, the General Assembly and the governor must come together and pass a budget so we can stop adding to this problem. Clearly, they have to determine the best way to reach consensus. But as the state's chief fiscal officer, I will make two recommendations. First, the budget must be balanced. As I've traveled the state, I've talked to businesses, nonprofit, and community leaders. They have all told me that the government does more damage by making promises of funding that we cannot fulfill. It does no good for us to inflate numbers, underfund critical services, play the numbers games, just to make the bottom line add up when at the end of the day, there's no money there to write that check. Second, the budget must send a clear signal to employers and families in Illinois that we are going to do things differently. Employers crave predictability so that they can plan and budget. And yet when they look at Illinois, they see a high tax state that is anything but predictable. They have no idea what their tax rate will be next year, or how it might increase or change after that, or what new regulations they might face. We are paying a price in our state for that uncertainty. Since January, Illinois has gained 13,400 new jobs. Compare that with the roughly 27,000 new jobs in Wisconsin, in Missouri, and 45,000 new jobs in Indiana. We have twice as many people in our state than any of these states, and yet they are creating 2 and 3 times the number of jobs than we are. Our fiscal future depends on our ability to change that dynamic, to create an environment that encourages businesses to grow, invest, and create great jobs here in Illinois that will ultimately help grow our economy and provide the revenue necessary that will allow us to fund critical services. And none of that is possible until we pass a budget. Every day, we see the consequences of our inaction in Springfield. More than 25,000 with developmental disabilities have lost access to services that they rely on. Agencies providing shelter to domestic violence victims are shutting their doors. Parents have watched their autistic children regress after being cut off from local service providers. Counties are struggling to keep their 911 emergency call centers operating in the absence of funding, and more than 130,000 college students are having their grant funding cut off. These are just a few of the examples of what is happening every day all across our state because we can't get a budget in place. These consequences range from difficult to untenable, but importantly, they are all avoidable. Between the House and the Senate, the General Assembly has had nearly 30 session days since July 1st. They've held more than 13 Committee of the Whole meetings. They've been paid over $4.8 million collectively in their salaries. And still, we have no budget. Our leaders in the General Assembly, with the governor, must come together and do the job that we elected them to do. And while I cannot make them act, I will continue to use the megaphone of my office to make sure that Illinoisans everywhere understand what is being done to our state. So thank you very much, and now I'm happy to answer any questions.
When we've met with you before, you've talked about how pension payments were being made, and so this is a switch from that, obviously. What about debt payments? Are those still being made, and are those in danger at all?
Debt payments are being made. We are really just looking as we move into our lowest revenue months, which are like now and into November. We see this cash crunch where we have mandated expenses of, and you see it on this chart here. We have pension payments, debt payments, the court-ordered mandates to all the social service organizations. They're all mandated, and the total of all the mandates adds up to more available cash. So we had to pick something that we could not pay right now, and we think by delaying but still making a pension payment within the calendar, within the fiscal year, it's really the best way to address this now.
Okay. You said that the December payment might be delayed as well?
Possibly. So we have a little higher tax revenues in December as a result of the buying that goes along with the holidays. When we get to that point, we'll be looking at what our cash flows are, and if we can, we'll make at least a partial payment, and potentially more. But really, right now, we are just in a point where the mandated spending we're being mandated by the courts because we don't have a budget is more than the revenues we have coming in.
How much is the December payment?
Our December pension payment is the same it's the same every month. It's $560 million. It's the biggest chunk of our mandated expenditures.
So you think you ought to compromise, the governor and the speaker, but how do you get them to develop the political will to do that?
That is honestly, Bill, the reason I'm out here every day trying to, talk about the need for a budget. I'm hoping that the more people who call them, who talk to them, will say it's really time for people to get together. And I think if it would help, I know my office has made ourselves available, any information available. We've been in contact, our staffs have, with the leaders and with the governor's office. I've joked about, offering to get a meeting together and bring sandwiches and chocolate chip cookies and say, come on, let's sit down, get a budget in place. Really, they just have to sit down and do it. And I think there's going to be give and take on both sides. But every single day, it's making it harder and harder for us to meet our mandated payments and critical needs of the state.
Ms. Munger, does that mean you reached out to the legislative leaders? You say your staff, but have you made calls to them?
I have not personally made calls on this specifically. I have talked to a number of the leaders over the last several weeks at various things I've been to. I've neither spoken directly to the governor about this. So.
And what do they say to you when you give them this dire outlook?
Everybody's comment is that no one wants to get to, there's just no movement. They're all sitting on both sides, and there's no movement.
Do you know when was the last time that the state missed the pension payment, and what's the penalty for doing so?
We're working very hard to make these payments, in the fiscal year. I know that under Comptroller Dan Hines, it was more of his practice to make the pension payments in chunks closer to the end of the year and not make them every month. We've been really working hard to make them every single month. We're hoping that by viewing this only as a delay and not a miss, still making it up in the fiscal year, that everything will be, will still be on track, because we certainly don't want to add to the problems of the funding that we have in our pension.
So you're saying if you make the November and the December payment by the end of December, that there would be no penalty?
Well, there's not really, there's not a penalty per se. Mm-hmm. The penalty is that we're taking money out of the pension fund now to pay. That reduces the total fund. We have $100+ billion, $110 billion in unfunded liabilities now. So, to the extent that we have to drag down that fund, makes it harder for us to meet the long-term obligations. That's why I think it's really important we get this paid back in the fiscal year. We won't be able to make these payments by the end of December, but when we get into the new year and in the spring months and where revenues start coming in as a result of taxes being paid, income taxes, we do tend to get a nice big bump. Last year we were able to pay down a bill backlog quite significantly during that period of time. This year we will first use those funds to repay the pensions.
So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, where does this notion come from that there's this $560 million that's due in November, and that by paying it, not paying it in November, that you're delaying it? Is it a chunk that's due at the end of the year, like the total amount that's due for every year, and you are spreading it out over the months? Is this a real deadline?
We have to fund the pensions under law, every year.